All right. Good noon, everybody. Welcome to Lunch Break Apostasies. Welcome back, I should say. Give me just a second here. All right. Well, very glad you decided to drop in. Last week we talked a little bit about the Anabaptists, and those are mainly a historical denomination. I guess if you were to find a true Anabaptist today, that wouldn't strictly exist. However, they do have plenty of descendants. This is where we get the Amish and the Mennonites from. As far as questions about them, we received a question last night. It wasn't really necessarily about the Anabaptists, but good question nevertheless. What was the was there a group that believed that theology and knowledge are sinful? Maybe somebody could help me out with this one, but I'm not aware of any group that has ever specifically taught that knowledge and theology are sinful. Now, you can certainly look to a lot of modern day groups which look down on theology, and it's almost a dirty word to them, which of course is not really rational. And there have been plenty of times throughout history where there have been movements against a rational type of theology and thinking. Um, but that in and of itself is a theology. And so to explicitly ban theology, that'd be more difficult. But perhaps there's some other groups I'm not necessarily aware of that would have taught just that exact thing. Um, Now, before we move on from the Anabaptist, I should mention something that I like about them and something that is good. And that would certainly be the willingness to separate from the world. Of course, this is most easily seen in today's Mennonites and Amish. But even back in the day, the Anabaptists were willing to separate themselves from the world. Uh, Now, theologically speaking, they were willing to do that, and it's possible that there were even people who were not apostate among the greater label Anabaptist, although to my knowledge, we don't have any historical record of them if they did exist. But it would be possible. Uh, at that time, of course, it was not governmentally acceptable by just about anybody to not baptize your children, not in Europe anyway. Uh, but they refuse to do that, which, by the way, is a biblical concept. You only see believers being baptized in the Bible. So, willingness to separate from the world of theology, and even in today's descendants of the Anabaptist, you see the same attitude. Now, of course, I would argue many of them go way too far in avoiding worldliness. But we do have a responsibility to avoid conforming to the world, where the Amish and the Mennonites, some of them, go too far on that, is refusing to conform to the world in places where it is biblical and scriptural to conform to the world, such as use of modern technology. When we don't conform to the world, it's of places where it would be sinful for us to, not just lack of conforming for conforming's sake. Um, Paul, after all, said that if it were the case that we were not to associate with sinners at all, then we were to go out of the world entirely. But he says, don't do that. Um, that's in 2 Corinthians, by the way. So just a few final thoughts concerning the Anabaptists. Today we're going over Anglicanism. Now, Anglicanism is definitely an interesting uh, topic for us as far as the Reformation goes because it doesn't really match the rest of the Reformation. Um, when you look at some of the other churches that begin as a result of the Reformation, what you find is that they tend to start, if nothing else, from a position of, I'm trying to think of the word, sincerity, perhaps would be the good way to put it. I have a lot of problems with some of the things that Martin Luther did, but it's hard for me to attack his sincerity. maybe he was a charlatan and a deceiver, but I don't think he was. I just don't think he was as thorough as he ought to have been, and he wasn't as concerned with doing what God wants us to do as he ought to have been. But I don't think he set out with the goal of using religion to further his personal life. I could say the same thing about Calvin or Zwingli or Knox, which we'll be studying a little bit later. I can't say that when it comes to Anglicanism. I think when you look at the history of Anglicanism, you see very strong ulterior motives from those who are behind its inception. Now, Anglicanism is unique among what we've studied so far for a couple of reasons, at least among Christian denominations. One of the things that makes Anglicanism different is this is going to be the first denomination we're studying which does not claim an AD 33 foundation. If you were to go to the Orthodox, they would say their church was founded in 33 AD or thereabouts. Same thing about the Roman Catholics. And you might think, well, what about the Lutherans and others in the Reformation movement? Well, they didn't see themselves as creating a new church, although practically they did, but at least in their own minds, they didn't create a new church, and they would say that they are just reforming the church that was already there. That's why it's called the Reformation. The Anglicans are unique, and this is the first ones who, even by their own standards, do not claim to have been founded in the first century. Now, that doesn't mean that they claim their foundation when it actually was founded, which was in the 16th century. If they claim it way further back, they would say that the Anglican Church had been around ever since the Catholic Church, or the Orthodox Church, or whatever you want to call it, first showed up in England under St. Augustine, who had a very similar role in England that St. Patrick supposedly did in Ireland. So they would trace it back to St. Augustine. And this shows that they think of it as a regional thing and not necessarily part of the entire body of the saved, as those previously mentioned denominations would. That being said, just because that's what the claim is, that doesn't really make it what it actually is. Up until the 16th century, there was no distinction between the Roman Catholic Church and the Church of England. It was just, this is what the Church of England, it's just a location, not a separate body. It really begins with King Henry VIII. Another reason the Anglicans are unique here. By the way, the word Anglican basically means English. The one of the reasons they're unique here is because they do not look to a person who is just a regular guy as a founder. Even among the world religions that we've looked through, they aren't being founded by kings. Right? Remember Islam? Muhammad, he was an important guy in Mecca, but he wasn't a king. Go back a little bit further, go to Buddhism. It was unthinkable, as the prophecy around the Buddha supposedly was, that he could both be a conquering king and a spiritual leader. Throughout the history of the world, those two things almost never come together. Even in legitimate, or at least at the time legitimate places, think of Judaism. Moses was, high ranking in the nation, and he was the grandson of a king, but he wasn't a king himself. And when he takes on that religious spiritual leader role, it kind of precludes him from being a king at the same time. So this is really unique, and this is the first time we see a king being the founder of an apostasy that I can think of anyway. Henry VIII was originally not supposed to be king. If he was around today, he would have written an autobiography called Spare, because he was the second born son. And because he was not expected to be king, he ends up being raised differently than many kings of England were at that time. It was the practice of taking the firstborn son and bringing him to a castle by himself, except with, of course, many servants, to be tutored and to learn and to be very specifically raised up for the purpose of becoming king. And he's taken away from his family very early on, except with visitations from his father. But Henry's older brother Arthur did not survive until full adulthood. He died very young, as a teenager, as I recall. And this caused a problem because Henry had spent too much time, at least in the English way of thinking at that time, he had spent too much time with his family. And because the king typically was more concerned with the heir, he didn't really spend much time with his father, and so most of the people in his life were women. I point this out because of the irony later in his life with his attitude towards women. Um, he is basically raised by his sisters, and they dote over him. He's the baby of the family. And as he grows up, he's actually a fairly charismatic guy. Once again, I point this out. If you know where he ends up, it's very strange, but he's this charismatic, athletic guy. It's said that he was very quick-witted, and he was popular. Everybody loved him, apparently. But after his brother dies, he ends up being torn away from that life and put into this new isolated life. He can't really go into some of the athletic pursuits he was interested in before because they're worried that the future king might get hurt in these. And then he ends up being wed to his brother's widow, Catherine of Aragon, who is significantly older than him, and he ends up being married to her when he turns 18. Now, you might think that he would be resentful from this, but it's said that at the beginning of their marriage, Catherine and Henry loved each other, which was uncommon for European monarchs of that time, seeing as most of them were political marriages and not love marriages. Despite the fact that this was a political marriage, Catherine's father was the King of Spain. Despite the fact that this was a political marriage, they actually loved each other for quite some time, and he continues to grow in popularity. Eventually, his father dies, and he's crowned king, and people like him. Eventually, he stops listening to his advisors, and he begins to go to some of the old pursuits that he enjoyed, such as jousting. And it's during a jousting accident that he ends up severely injuring his leg, possibly his head too, as some have pointed out. Um, I don't know if that's necessarily true, but it's something interesting to look up if you're ever so inclined. And around the same time that he has this jousting accident, it becomes apparent that Catherine is unable to bear him a male heir, which tends to be pretty important for kings. And at the same time, he kind of knows that it's not, at least in his mind, it's not his fault that this is happening, um, because Henry has mistresses. And one of his mistresses bears him a couple of male children. And there tends to be rumors that circle around the marriage of Henry and Catherine. They have plenty of children, by the way. During their marriage, she was probably pregnant more often than she wasn't. Um, but that actually probably helped the marital strife a little bit. It was thought that it was poor for a man's health to go for a certain amount of time without relations. And it was also thought that it was an evil thing to fulfill that need with a pregnant woman. And so whenever she would be pregnant, they wouldn't do anything. And it was almost considered more honorable for him to have mistress. Now, obviously, all of that's complete hogwash, but he's having he's having the mistresses. And then they're only having girls. People also thought it might be cursed because he had no right to marry her. They had this interesting interpretation of the Old Testament saying that a man cannot marry his brother's wife, which is a general truth, but the Old Testament actually teaches what we call levirate marriage. That is, if you have an older brother and he has a wife, you're actually obligated to marry her if she dies, so that his children can have an inheritance. Um, and this would fall under levirate marriage. Now, it's all irrelevant because it's Old Testament anyway, but it's interesting how they came to those conclusions. Anyway, as the rumors continue to swirl around Henry and Catherine, he gets it in his head he'd like to have this annulled. He believes that it never should have happened in the first place because of the fact that she was his brother's wife. He wants to get a new wife to hopefully bear him a male heir. But he's denied an annulment from the Pope. The Pope, by the way, didn't really have much of a choice. By the way, this is around the year 530. He didn't really have much of a choice in annulling Henry's marriage because it just so happened that he was under the thumb of Spain at that time. And as we mentioned, Catherine was from Spain, so they weren't going to be putting up with that. Denied the annulment, Henry becomes more and more power mad. By the way, at this point, ever since a leg injury, he's been packing on the pounds pretty much, and he probably looks at something a little bit more like that portrait that we have of him here. This portrait was actually, and this is probably the most famous portrait of Henry, it was actually taken or painted, I suppose, with the goal of making him seem more healthy than he actually was. But he continues to gain weight. He continues to descend into madness. And very famously, he would have 6 wives within his lifetime. One of the members here at Percival had a nice little a saying for remembering what happened to each of his wives. Um, it was divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived. That's what happened to each of the 6 wives. And I can't remember all of their names at the moment. There was Catherine of Aragon, and then after he divorces her, he ends up marrying Anne Boleyn. And then there is Jane Seymour, Catherine Howard. I think half of them were named Catherine. Um, anyway, he only ever manages to produce one male heir from any of these marriages. And that one reigned for a few years as a child, but then died. Um, and by the end of his reign, Henry's reign was really considered a reign of terror. He betrayed his friends. Anybody who wouldn't go along with him. Oh, I forgot to mention, he ends up declaring himself the head of the Church of England. And this is in the year 530. So this is really when we see the Church of England established. At the time, nothing really seems. A lot of Protestant leaning people in England were thinking that this would be a great thing and then we'd have a Protestant church. But at the time, it really wasn't like the rest of the Protestants. Um, I guess technically it's in protest of the Catholic Church, so you could say it's Protestant, although I don't believe that's actually why Protestant churches are called Protestant. But in its practices, it basically is still Catholic. It just listens to Henry VIII now instead of the Pope. Many people who are loyal to the Catholic Church die during this time. He commences this reign of terror. Of course, even his own wives are not exempt from this. And, like we said, he ended up having 2 of them beheaded. He eventually dies, but he leaves England a much worse place than he found it. After the reign of Henry VIII, his son, whose name escapes me at the moment, like we mentioned, he dies very young age and is replaced by his sister, one of the a daughter from Catherine of Aragon. Her name is Mary Tudor. She ends up trying to sway England towards Catholicism once again. You think about it, she has a stake in Roman Catholicism being correct, because, of course, the Pope never did annul the marriage between Catherine and Henry VIII, meaning any other child that came afterwards was not legitimate, but that's only by Catholic standards. So she had a reason to be Catholic, and she ended up commencing a reign of terror on her own. This time, it's against those who aren't Catholic. So you have to endure a reign of terror if you're Catholic during Henry's time, and then you got to endure another reign of terror later by Mary. And this was how she ends up getting the nickname Bloody Mary. When she uh, ends up losing the throne to her half sister Elizabeth, who is a daughter of Anne Boleyn. Just like Mary has stakes in her legitimacy based upon the Catholic view, Elizabeth has stakes in her legitimacy based upon the Anglican view. And so she, once again, swings Britain back towards the idea of Anglicanism. However, her version of the Anglican Church is a lot different than her father's was. Remember that Henry's version of the Anglican was basically just Catholics, except instead of the Pope, we're going to the King. Elizabeth did a lot to Protestantize the Anglican Church and make it much more like the Protestant churches, especially from a theological standpoint. She also ends up legalizing the Catholic and Puritan faiths. Puritan, by the way, and these are going to be important as we continue in on this study. But a Puritan was basically somebody who lived in Britain, and they wanted to be Protestant, but they wanted it to be more Protestant than the Church of England was. They can sometimes be similar to the Anabaptists, but basically the Puritans are thinking, we want a real Protestant church, just not just a Catholic church that answers to a different pope. Well, she ends up legalizing basically you're not going to die if you're Catholic or you're a Puritan, and you're allowed to practice whatever faith. At the time, this was one of the most liberal policies concerning freedom of religion. However, she does limit it only to Anglicans who are allowed to serve in the government. So that's the compromise of Elizabeth. She ends up making the Anglican Church more Protestantized, but still not as much as the Puritans would like. And also, by the way, if you happen to be Puritan or Catholic, you're not going to die for it. Um, she ends up seeing an expansion of Anglicanism into Scotland, Ireland, and the Americas. I got Ireland's there. There should only be one Ireland there, but she has it all set over there. Overall, this seems to really solidify what Anglicanism is, and it brings a certain level of peace uh, from a religious standpoint to England. But because she is so focused on Anglicanism, and this just so happens to be the time where England really starts to become a world empire, then Anglicanism ends up spreading absolutely everywhere. Now, when you look at the doctrine of Anglicanism, you'll notice it tends to have certain things which we associate with Reformed churches and others not so much. We do have the idea of sola scriptura. However, there is still a physical head, at least in theory, over the Anglican Church today. You have acceptance of some of the more standard creeds you see within Catholicism, such as the Nicene Creed, the Apostles' Creed, and the Athanasian Creed. Um, and you also see a few other things that we typically associate not with Protestants but with Catholics. You do have infant baptism, which most Protestants do practice, or at least at this time did practice. Um, it's interesting that's only by immersion or pouring. You don't have sprinkling. And you have the belief that baptism saves. This is different than the Protestants at that time who really don't believe baptism saves. However, like the Protestants of the time, you have two sacraments, not seven. That is baptism, which we've already explained, and you also have Eucharist. The Eucharist, under their belief, is consubstantive, which would be how Luther saw the Eucharist. It was the body and the blood of Christ. It's just not literally turning into skin and blood when it enters your body. It's and he ends up explaining it. It's similar in the same way that you have the Trinity. God can both be the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, and this can both be bread and body. That's the consubstantive view. So we're taking some Protestant ideas. The transubstantive view of the Catholic Church was that it is literally turning into these things. You also have the maintenance of the Catholic saints and calendar. That might sound like that's a point towards Catholicism, but actually the Protestants were doing the same thing. In the modern day, you see that it tends to be pretty liberal. That's because it's still associated with governments, and as a result, it tends to follow the trends and tides of governments. It's associated with the British government, and so the modern Anglican Church tends to teach legalization of abortion and appoints openly gay bishops. Um, you also see icons and veneration of Mary sometimes within that church. So, once again, it points towards Catholicism. If you were to ask the question, which of the Protestant denominations is most Catholic, you'd be hard pressed to find an answer better than the Anglicans. If not, then the Lutherans would be the closest one. But there's a lot. If you go to an Anglican service, it's going to look really Catholic. And if you are coming from a Protestant viewpoint, then there's very, very little different. The hierarchy within the Anglican Church. By the way, I don't know if we've mentioned this so far or not. If the Anglican Church exists outside of the Church of England, then it goes by the title Episcopal. And so if you see a local Episcopalian church, then that's an Anglican church that just doesn't, it's not in England. The hierarchy of the Anglican Church, once again, looks very Catholic. You have deacons, much like the Catholics. These are people who are considered lay people, that is, they're not clergy. They don't hold any sort of special office, but they are allowed to do certain things that the other minds might not expect. I believe in Anglicanism that includes baptizing or preaching. The priests, or sometimes they're called the presbyters, hold a similar role once again to Catholics. Bishops, once again. Here's where you get a little bit of a strange thing going on here, and this is always seems to be the case even before the inception of the Anglican Church. You have a power play here because supposedly, in one sense, the name of or the head of the Anglican Church is the King of England. Um, However, you end up also having the Archbishop of Canterbury, who, while the Catholics were around, was always the head bishop in charge of the region of England. That also seems to be the leader of the church. And I have not been able to find a clear answer as to who really is at the very top. Um, my suspicion is that it's the Archbishop of Canterbury. By the way, that's a picture of the current Archbishop of Canterbury. I think he would be the one, but I wouldn't be able to prove it necessarily. I'm just now noticing that that cane he's got there, it appears to have a mouse carved into it. Not sure what the significance of that is, but that's interesting. Anyway, that's a real quick look at Anglicanism. Obviously, we don't have much to say as far as the doctrine goes, just because it's mostly similar doctrine to Catholicism, with a little bit of the Protestantism sprinkled in there. It's definitely interesting. Um, Mostly what makes it interesting and unique is that its history and how it was founded a lot different than most other denominations. It's prevalent, though, I should say that. Just about every denomination, of course, you might be thinking in my region, we don't have a lot of these denominations we've talked about so far. We might not have a lot of Catholics or Orthodox uh, or Lutherans or Anabaptists. Uh, and we don't have a lot of Episcopalians. Well, that might be true, but I bet you got a lot of denominations that come out of Anglicanism, and it's interesting to see where that ends up showing up. But anyway, oh, thank you, Faye. Thank you. That should cover the Anglicans for now. Next week, we'll be talking about the Presbyterians and John Knox. I look forward to seeing you there, and bye for now.